My name is Gabriela Garcia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently living on unceded Mohican territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, colonized as Troy, New York. I'm one of the co-founders of Decoding Stigma, an interdisciplinary cross-institutional working group about sex work, tech, and the academy. In essence, we've grown into a distributed network of radical individuals stranded on different institutional islands, coming together to try to answer the question, what can tech learn from sex workers? The Heaux History Project has a wealth of answers to that question, and I am honored to introduce them here this evening for Black Beyond Origins. The Heaux History Project is documenting Black, Brown, and Indigenous erotic labor histories and sex workers' rights movements through essays, zines, and other publications, digital archives, interviews, and film. In Kunti Mimi's own words, who will be speaking this evening as well, Heaux History explores how sex work, all right, I guess we have our first troll. That person needs to get kicked out. All right, Heaux History explores how sex work interacts with everything from hip hop culture and video vixens to labor politics and unions, accessibility, and more.
Can you let my friend back in? He says he's sorry. He's in the waiting room.
Also, you can go too.
All right. Are we done, trolls? Okay. All right. The project archives the many different worlds that interact under the umbrella of sex work while centering the movements, politics, cultures, and legacies of Black, Brown, and Indigenous sex worker communities globally. So without further ado, and hopefully further in lack of interruption, I will introduce this evening's speakers. Kunti Mimi is a performing artist, dominatrix, and community organizer. Their sound fuses the past and the future of hip hop. Genre bending, but grounded in the elements of hip hop, Kunti pushes to create sounds that inspire organized chaos against tyranny, which sounds exactly what I need right now. Kunti focuses on world building, not only in music, but in our communities. As an organizer, their work centers on creating alternative systems and autonomy for oppressed people. They are currently based in Chicago and currently serve as co-creative director of Heaux History. Zio is an artist, DJ, former culture writer, and dom based in Houston, Texas. His work explores Black femmehood, kink, and beauty as related to online sex work. He currently serves as co-creative director, and content creator of Heaux History. And Rebel Kunt is an indie scholar, researcher, writer, and organizer from Chicago. Current full-service sex worker and cam model, former exotic dancer. Their work centers on Black erotic labor and collecting the narratives, stories of community members. So with that in mind, I will pass it on to Zio, who will start this evening's conversation.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Hi, everyone. I'll get started by sharing my screen. We'll get right into things. Alrighty, as Gabriela mentioned, my name is Zio. I am a co-creative director here at Heaux History, a DJ and consensual artist, and a former culture writer and a dom. I'll be using my experiences in these current and past roles to expand on my presentation today. And this is where you can find me online. Okay, got accidentally muted. Alrighty. So I'm gonna start off with a couple of background context points. This presentation, a lot of what we're talking about here today is kind of an expansion on the work that Heaux History did for our Black History Month takeover. We wanted to really start a dialogue about sex work and sex worker culture by contextualizing its influence and its importance on the dominant culture around it. We use music and music culture and to some extent pop culture as the vehicle to help us explore this influence because music is just one of the mediums that we can really see clearly where this influence comes from and how it makes its impact. For my contribution in particular, I focused on the decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and really following the shift in sex work and popular culture using disco and house music as a vehicle to do so, since these are popular genres of the time. Also, disco and house just happens to be some of my favorite genres of music, specifically for the way that they highlight Black and gay artists within those eras, and as we'll see, to a later extent, sex work as well. And the 60s and 70s as decades in particular kind of really highlight the mark or highlight the cultural revolution, not just around sex work, but just around the way that we think about sex and the erotic. And we can really see that reflected in the music that is consumed during those times. So before we really get started into things, I did want to give some backgrounds into the 1960s because that is a lot of where the landmark movement and cases that really push along the ideas of disco get started. Really with the sexual revolution of the 60s, which is where the free love and sex movement, the second wave of the feminist movement, and the gay rights movement all come together to present new ideas about sex, the erotic, and pleasure. So it's during the 60s that we see a lot of landmark changes around just the way that people talk about sex. We start to see, even with lessening of book bans, the introduction of birth control, the introduction of co-education in higher education and higher institutions, we start to see that people question a lot of the ideas around sex, including who should have it, how you should have it, when you should have it, and what relationships and dynamics you should have it in. The three movements mentioned in particular all really advocate for the idea that sex can and should exist outside of marriage, and that sex and the erotic are just parts of our natural lives, so it shouldn't be really restricted to procreation or anything like that. And so during the 60s, when we see a lot of those cultural shifts, we also see a shift in sort of the way that art is created and consumed, especially with music. In music in particular, in the music industry, we see the rise of the self-contained band. So gone are the days of, popular songwriting teams or songwriting duos having control over how music is created. Bands are able to completely write and arrange music all on their own, and so they have more control about what they talk about, including sex and everyday relationships. But even when this is happening in the mid to late 1960s, we do still see a bit of a gender and race gap in sort of how and when artists are able to talk about sex. Men usually of all races are able to really talk about and pen about sex freely, whereas women across all racial grounds and backgrounds are sort of really restricted in how often or when they would talk about sex or what dynamics they would talk about sex in their music. And so it's really with the 1970s that we start to see a lot of these restrictions lessening. Even though this does happen in regards with women in terms of gender, in terms of race, we still see some restriction up into the 1970s, especially with Black female soul singers. Even though sex does get mentioned a little bit later, in some of the popular hits that come about during that time, it's really within the confines of a relationship and with some anxiety around being chased, not getting into sex too often or too freely. And so disco kind of really, as we'll see, disco kind of really allows Black women and Black soul singers to experiment with subject matter a lot more. And so to that effect, I would really say that disco in its own way is a soundtrack to Black people's sexual revolution. So even though in the 1960s we do see a lot of those shifts happening, it isn't until the 1970s, early 1970s and beyond, with the popularity of disco, that Black people are really able to take in and experiment with the ideals that are presented by the free love and sex movement. So disco and the sexual revolution, there are a bunch of different reasons why disco ends up being that soundtrack. Just a couple important ones I'll touch on. Disco music and culture really acts as an equalizer in the music industry. So since songwriting groups are kind of go to the wayside, pretty much anyone can create and write and arrange their own top hit. Songwriting teams, again, aren't really as popular. Bands are really just keeping all of that in-house, and so we really get to see a shift in who is able to become a big disco star. Black femme soul singers in particular are using disco in the early 1970s to sort of reinvent themselves. For example, LaBelle's Lady Marmalade, their 1974 hit, is a sharp kind of departure from the music they created in the 1960s. Subject matter really expands. Black femme soul singers in particular are able to write about all sorts of different subject matters, topics and subject matter, including relationships, sex, pleasures, desires, really sort of every woman, everyday experiences. But disco in particular becomes popular with Black working class individuals just because it's viewed a little bit more authentic than the shiny veneer that soul music presents. It's because it is able to talk about things like drugs, crime, and sex. And it's written from the point of view of all types of community members, even the ones that other people would consider unsavory. So a lot of the early and proto-disco hits, for example, are written from the perspective of like drug dealers, for example, with Curtis Mayfield's Pusher Man, which is written in 1972. The early 1970s, 1973 and 74 is also the first time that we start to see a lot of music written around the idea of the pimp and the hoe, which is just another community member that isn't really seen in popular culture until the rise of blaxploitation films in the early 70s. So Willie Dynamite, for example, is one of the first blaxploitation films that we see that is actually written and follows a pimp, Willie, and his stable. And then the soundtrack for the movie is one of the first soundtracks we actually see written in the point of view of a pimp and a hoe. So even though it's written and sung by R&B star Martha Reeves, it still focuses on sex workers in a very direct way that is unusual for that time. And you know, blaxploitation films is really what gives rise to that. Okay, so I'll say for sure that Willie Dynamite and a lot of the soundtracks, the disco soundtracks, so hits that become popular in this time that talk about sex work, kind of mark a sharp departure from sort of the porno chic that is popular at the time from the 1970s. So with the golden age of porn, which really peaks with the introduction of pornography theaters and with the peak of Playboy and Hustler, I believe Hustler comes about in the mid 1970s. Porn, in some ways, in some form of sex work, actually becomes really popular. Porn stars become popular in their own right. So stars that appear in Playboy and Hustler and in these very popular, you know, pornography movies become popular and able to gain their own, basically their own following and able to mingle with celebrities at parties and in discotheques. And in the same time that's happening, a lot of the disco hits and the music that's being penned in reference to sex work isn't about the glamour side of porn and things like that. It's written about, you know, quote unquote streetwalkers and sort of everyday sex workers that kind of fit within disco's themes of, you know, writing about the experiences of everyday people. Disco in general, though, really does reflect sort of like the new shift and focus on the erotic. Disco itself is a very erotic type of music. It encourages and sort of births dance culture where a lot of dances are meant to be partnered and close together. They're done to sped up African and Latin drums and rhythm. And so the next step from there is that, you know, in addition to talking about sex, vocalists and songwriters are able to actually illustrate sex and ecstasy in their music. A lot of disco hits will include hums, groans, moans to sort of simulate that ecstasy. And as disco music becomes really popular, so do discotheques themselves. They start to spread in New York, LA, and Chicago in particular, in these suburbs where America's youth, especially their white youth, are being introduced to this type of music and culture for the first time. And a lot of the themes in disco music that become really popular have to really circle around personal and sexual expression and really acceptance of this expression. A lot of the music, a lot of the themes really encourage experimentation, whether it be with fashion or clothing or the way that you live, with sex in itself. And a lot of it is like really about like individualism, identity based. So I'm my own person. This is the way that I prefer to live my life. So in an effort to really sum a lot of what's happening in this decade up, I really present Donna Summer as a case study, not the perfect case study. It is a long decade, lots do happen, but we do get to see a lot of the very important societal and technical, influence of disco in her music. A lot of the themes that sort of happen with disco music and disco culture are also pretty present with Donna Summer. For example, the idea of songwriting, arranging, doing all of that in-house. Summer is really well known, becomes actually popular for the fact that she writes and arranges most of her music in collaboration with other producers. She also becomes, throughout the 1970s, especially from the mid to late 1970s, really well known for her performances. And so a lot of her work continues to cover just a lot of the disco feminism that's like popular for this time. So being an individual woman, having sex, having preferences, having desires for the way that she preferred to live her life, and this is what becomes really popular for the music of that age. Critics really respond to her positively in the late 1970s, and so we'll see a little bit later she uses that popularity and that newfound platform to discuss sex work in new and different ways. But again, I think one good thing that Donna Summer is a great case study for is, again, disco as the erotic. A lot of her music does simulate a lot of ecstasy, pleasure. It discusses the way that she wants to have sex, who she prefers to have sex with. Even though Donna Summer herself in her personal life kind of really struggled with her subject matter, she did believe on some level that it was important to really exist and talk about these subjects as a Black woman in the public eye. So the final theme that we can really point to as far as disco goes in Donna Summer's music is the sound of the everyday woman. And it's within that sort of theme that Donna Summer creates Bad Girls, which is her 1980s album and single, in which she is depicted and writing about sex workers. On the cover, she's depicted as a streetwalker who's interacting with a police officer. In the titular single and its video, she depicts sex workers, on screen for the first time, I think, in that decade. If you've ever seen the Bad Girls video, you know exactly what it's about. And it's a really interesting release for Summer to do at that time because, again, this is the early 1980s. She's really staked and made her claim as a performer, as a singer and a songwriter. She's getting more critic acclaim than she has ever gotten before, and she chooses to use this platform to really explore lives of sex workers with her art and with her music. And so that kind of falls into the theme again of disco hits and disco themes really being about the everyday woman, everyday man, everyday person. So we're not really, again, writing about porn stars. We're not really writing about the glamorous lives of Playboy bunnies. We're writing about, again, streetwalkers. We're writing about, who's walking the stroll. So a sharp decline from Porno Chic. So to really, again, kind of get into how disco culture, club culture really contributes to a lot of the shifts that we see in this decade, discotheques become really, really popular. And with that, we start to see like a shift in sort of how sex work is conducted within cities, large cities. Even though discotheques are originally born of 1940s Germany, again, we see with disco music, they really begin to become popular in New York, LA, and Chicago. A lot of the discotheques of that time are based in mixed city districts, which are just residential and business, just basically residential and business districts, that are really, really close together. And so clubs would sort of really pop up there next to residential neighborhoods, which kind of earned them a backlash as the decade goes on. A lot of people felt that discotheques didn't belong in residential neighborhoods or kind of brought along a lot of seedy behavior. And so we'll see that start to swell into a bigger sort of like anti-disco backlash later in the decade. But discotheques became really popular because they could be clubs, they could be like licensed clubs, but they also could be DIY. We'll see a lot of gay and trans communities start to throw their own discos or start to build their own discotheques wherever they could, whether it be friends' homes, warehouses, spaces that were originally reserved for drag balls. And they would avoid selling liquor, so they could basically host these whenever and wherever they could, and also avoid any harassment from the police or any curfew laws. And with the popularity of discotheques, we start to see the sex working community shift from the outskirts of the cities, where peers would be closer to where discotheques are, deeper into cities, deeper into these mixed use districts. A lot, and they begin to actually live in a lot of these residential neighborhoods, so they could stay closer to the discotheques, could stay closer to their clients. And we're able to really mingle with like, you know, higher level, higher celebrity clients in these various discotheques. And so that also, you know, contributes, the presence of sex workers also contributes to the backlash that a lot of discotheques start to see. So really it's by, you know, 1977, 1978 with the introduction of Saturday Night Live that we actually start to see the fall and later death of disco. Backlash really starts and swells in the late 1970s. It's kind of due to a lot of different factors. There's been, you know, by that time, we've had the 1979 oil crisis. There's been some recession, so there's been a lot of like economic and societal like conservatism that starts to become really popular in response to these crises. Also in the 1980s Grammys, a lot of disco artists start to basically sweep that awards ceremony, which earns even more backlash. The anti-disco ranks, it's kind of just an agglomeration of like rock fans, disillusioned disco fans who no longer feel like disco is what it used to be, and just people who are anti-Black, anti-gay, weren't really happy with the new platforms that Black and gay artists were earning with disco music. I really feel that anti-disco sentiments really come to a swell with Disco Demolition Night in Comiskey Park, Chicago in 1979. If you're familiar at all with that event, it's essentially a demonstration in which disco records are blown up in the middle of the park, and kind of signals people's like frustration with disco music and culture. So it's really after Disco Demolition Night that we really start to see like an outward wave of anti-disco sentiments, not just among people, but in the industry. Disco records, they're still being released in the early 1980s, but they start to get slotted onto what is called dance charts now. So Billboard's dance chart comes into effect in the early 1980s to sort of be able to chart what's happening with disco, but not calling it disco, essentially. Also in the early 1980s, we had the emergence of the AIDS epidemic, which points to further like social backlash, anti-gay, anti-Black, anti-homeless backlash from people who feel that the AIDS epidemic was basically in some way or shape or form a result of a lot of the free love and sex movement and ideas that come along with the disco era. And so in response to that, in response to the loss of the AIDS epidemic, the club community in New York, LA, Chicago, and these big cities start to become much smaller, more tight-knit, and more underground. We start to see a lot, again, the gay and trans communities throwing their own parties wherever they can, warehouses and friends' houses and things like that. So the birth of house we can really track to Chicago, of course. It's within these parties, these gay and queer parties, that a lot of DJs start to experiment with playing sped up R&B and soul tracks. They start to edit them on borrowed equipment. They start to experiment with the way that they transition, the way that they mix this music together. And eventually in 1983, the term house music is born of the music that these Black queer DJs are playing in various venues across Chicago. As most people know, the birth of house has really contributed to Frankie Knuckles and Ron Hardy, but there are also other groups, other queer DJs in Chicago that we can point to. House music in particular reinvigorates the large voguing scene in NYC and Chicago. Just the music and sort of the styles of house music really starts to bleed into these communities, and so we'll see like we start to see a large club and dance community that's born of house music. And sort of really to wrap this up, I wanted to talk a lot, or a bit, I should say, about dance and house music's disco roots, because it's really in these genres that come after disco, of course, that we see how much disco in particular has been impactful to the way that we think, write, and talk about sex in music in particular. If it wasn't for disco, we really wouldn't have a lot of the club culture and the dance culture that we see today. Again, because disco was really insistent on dance crazes, really encouraged partner dancing, really encouraged dancing late into the night. A lot of what we consider modern club culture today is born in the sort of transition from disco to dance culture in the early 1980s. But also, house and dance music really retain a lot of the ideals that disco is known for, especially in themes of sexual and personal expression, acceptance, pleasure. Does take a little bit from the free love movements in the 1960s and 1970s, for example. And also house music and dance music really kind of falls in line with disco's insistence on in-house songwriting and arranging. So DJs that are creating house music are completely doing it themselves. No need for like songwriting teams. Vocalists are doing it themselves. Disco's dance culture is also obviously very apparent. And more importantly, disco's eroticism can really be found in dance and house music. Of course, we can really talk about just Prince and Janet Jackson and everything that was going on in that time. I use them as case studies because, again, I think it really points to the way that disco heavily influenced how dance artists of that time would talk and write about music. If it wasn't for a lot of the free love and sex ideas that are covered with disco music, we wouldn't be able to be we wouldn't be able to see a lot of the, more sexually explicit themes in the 1980s dance music that we see. In a lot of ways, disco really covers a lot of ground or does a lot of the foundational work. So artists in the 1980s are able to take their expression of sex, the erotic pleasure to different heights. This in the 1980s is really when we start to see a lot of like taboo subject matter start to come into lyricism, and it kind of inspires a lot of sort of like censorship-based backlash from the 1980s and on. In general, though, I still basically posit that if it wasn't for disco, if it wasn't for the ideas and sort of the technicalities that disco artists are able to start experimenting with from the 1970s on, we really wouldn't have a lot of the genres that we see today. We wouldn't have a lot of the sexual expression in music that we see today, and more importantly, we wouldn't be able to really explore sex work in music in the resulting decades without disco to platform sex workers in its own way. So that really concludes or makes up most of my presentation.
Thank you, Zio.
Absolutely.
Hey, y'all. I'm Rebel, and I am the creator, the founder of Heaux History. I hope you can hear me. My mouth is literally on the... I be whispering.
I can hear you.
Okay. I first just want to say, if you really appreciate the information that Zio just shared and you want to send some love his way, you can find them on Venmo at Hyperfemme. That's HYPERFEMME. And now I will start. Just to sort of add to where Zio left off, he mentioned that, we have house music and disco that sort of is the soundtrack, right? And then also we had soul and we have funk, and all these genres together help to create what we know as like the current hip hop sound and also contemporary R&B. And I'm throwing contemporary R&B in here too, because the two are so linked from this point on moving forward that it has to be mentioned. So we're moving from, seeing as far as lyricism is concerned and sexual liberation, but also the exploration of sex work and erotic labor in lyrics, kind of coincides with, hoes leaving the stroll, and maybe not leaving the stroll, but staying there and renegading. And this isn't to say that pimps and Macs dominated, but it is to say that we are moving from a sort of golden Mac era, the heyday of pimps. The aesthetic we associate with pimp culture is heavy in the 1970s, sorry. So we're moving from that era, and we're also expanding what sex work looks like in that avenue. And so we're walking into the popularization of porn, or at least the tip of that iceberg, which then like expands possibilities as far as renegading is concerned. And for those who don't know, renegading is operating as a sex worker, full service sex worker, solo dolo. It means that you don't have representation, you don't work for an agency, you're just out there freestyling on your own. So moving from the 80s and into the 90s, we have like advancements with technology. And as we've seen over the last few decades alone, when there are advancements in technology, that also expands how sex workers can navigate erotic labor, how we can get our coin, how we can advertise. I mean, and also on the flip side, it does give pimps options as far as how to manipulate systems to be able to survive off of full service workers. Either way, I bring up pimp culture in this moment because it heavily influences hip hop, and in particular, Black men who are rappers from this period and also well into this one. And not that this is reactionary, because Black femmes have always been part of hip hop and they've always been part of Black music in whole and helped to create it as well. But we do see two interesting reactions to that from Black femmes in music. And that is either sort of, I'm not your bitch, I'm not your hoe, I'm not a bitch, I'm not a hoe, to reclaiming, I am a bitch, I am that bitch, I am a hoe. And then there's these gray areas in between. Sorry if you can hear the train in the background. Okay. So we have artists, for instance, who come out in the 90s. Of course, we have the 80s, and we have like feminism in lyrics. And we can definitely bring up Salt and Pepper, for instance. They're a great example. And then we also have artists who do fluctuate between those two spectrums that I shared. And but we also are introduced to hoe adjacent and hoe artists, and hoe adjacent being, you know, maybe fits the hoe aesthetic or is pro hoe, but didn't necessarily work as an erotic laborer or a sex worker. And then also what we would consider an actual hoe in the music industry, which is someone who has a sex working background. And so examples of this that immediately come to mind as far as hoe adjacent is concerned would be like Lil' Kim, who kind of kicks through this door and opens up this pathway. And then we also have Foxy Brown. But then later in the 90s, we're introduced to people who have sex working backgrounds and are open about those histories, like Trina and Eve. And also during this time, we're entering sort of this heyday of the video vixen era, which then maybe 10 years later starts to take this decline. And that happens because of the presence of vocal sex workers. And someone to insert right here would be Corinne Steffens. And I think this is interesting because we also are seeing at this time like BET's Uncut and other TV programs or underground stations where you can see more sexually explicit videos. And what maybe people don't know about that particular time is with video vixens, which they do kind of fall under the erotic labor umbrella. Quite a few of them were urban models who looked at sex workers coming into their industry as the reason why they weren't getting paid as much. And part of this is because once we are introduced to sort of these underground modes of entertainment where, you know, what would be considered raunchier videos are being shared, most of their principal models and most of their background models are from strip clubs, they are from the stroll, they are actual hoes. And so Corinne Steffens for me like represents this very interesting mixture of the two because they were an urban model. They also dibbled and dabbled in porn. They're a survivor in many different ways, but was also very vocal about their involvement in full service sex work and using sort of their platform or their career as a video vixen to essentially reel in their clients. And I think some of the hate around their existence or what they've provided artistically and creatively has a lot to do with folks thinking that they were too vocal, because ultimately hoes are supposed to keep our mouths shut and so on and so forth. I think Corinne represents this very interesting mixture of, you know, like this is sort of not the first time. This is where we see someone who's been involved in Black sex work who finds success publishing a book, whether it's a tell-all and people have issues with that. What Corinne is able to do is create conversations around autonomy and what that looks like for Black sex workers, and in a larger conversation, what that looks like for video vixens, what that looks like for urban models who ultimately are thrown into the same category anyway, because of how hypersexualized our bodies are and how we are sexualized in community in the first place, and in this industry in particular. And so as we like see this switch in music, we're also seeing that you know, hip hop and contemporary R&B then becomes the soundtrack for Black erotic labor as well. So in strip clubs and also on the stroll and things like that. But also more importantly, it's the Ho anthems that really stand out. So hits like Lil Kim's Queen Bitch, for instance, or Foxy Brown's Il Nana, a lot of songs by Eve, damn near everything from Trina. And there's so many different artists that we could bring up here who really fit this bill. But I think what's important, especially as we move from the 90s into the early 2000s, is sort of what Zio was talking about in the 70s, where you do see this insight into Black erotic labor and sex work from the perspective of folks who are on the stroll, from folks who may have come up in that era with Max and with pimps. And then as we move into this particular area, we're seeing similar conversations about autonomy, but in a different terrain. And so at this time, we're also looking at the ramifications of the crack epidemic. We're also looking at what's left from the 70s and the various socio-political movements that happened. And we're still going on well into this time. And so the overlap in those movements and to this soundtrack is that sex workers have always been part of these movements, whether we're talking about, you know, gay and trans rights and sort of the legends and the elders that we think of from the 60s and 70s, also the civil rights movement going into the 80s and 90s, the response to, you know, like the war on drugs, or our educational system, also just living conditions and displacement, survival, and what that looks like as a Black femme in erotic labor spaces, especially in spaces that are dominated by men and that are you know, modeled with white supremacy politics in place. So I think entering sort of the early 2000s, especially, we start to see more conversations that come out of these songs, out of these environments, out of these communities that are very specific and have to do with racism in erotic labor spaces, colorism in erotic labor spaces, you know, the difference in pay and compensation. And, you know, at this time, we're seeing, you know, like we've moved from discotheques, right? And we've moved sort of from the porn theater, but we do have peep shows and we do have phone sex operators. We're starting to see the first wave of what an EHO looks like. And in these spaces, you have people who are starting to produce theoretical and creative works, and who are also organizing on the ground. Someone who comes to mind during this particular era is Sayabon Brooks, and they were in erotic labor who worked in a peep show and just noticed sort of the racial politics involved in those spaces and wrote a book about this, did a study in predominantly Black and brown clubs, mixed clubs, white clubs where there are Black and brown dancers, and just sort of found that in all of these spaces, Black femmes and brown are experiencing the same thing no matter what the environment is, which is anti-Blackness and trans misogyny and misogynoir and colorism and unequal pay, unequal treatment at the workplace, sexual harassment, things of that nature. But also there's a pride in navigating those things and finding a way to survive, which we find in some of these anthems. I want to take a moment to say that if you do have a moment and you're interested in looking into like more analysis around pimp culture and ideology, or just the connection between hoes and hip hop in general, we have a couple of links on our Instagram and also through Less Magazine under those particular titles. I'll also be screenshotting and sharing what I can throughout the night and tying that in with the research that we've done during Black History Month, just so you can get like an audio visual experience along with this. I'm gonna pass it to Mimi, but I do want to take a moment just to check in with Zio and Mimi, because something that's come up in each one of our eras and each one of our bits of research is sort of this understanding around Black eroticism in lyrics, lyricism that has to do with sexuality and sexual identity, and exploring those things. And Black erotic labor spaces sort of being the first places that welcome artists like this, or who break really popular records. And so I want to take a moment for Zio and Mimi to kind of share from their particular their particular eras, and bits of research, like what that looked like during their times. And then we'll move on with Mimi, who's going to wrap things up with the 2000s into the 2020s, and what hip hop looks like, and also this new sound that they call dom rap.
Yeah, for sure. And I can definitely kick things off. So, again, as we really see in the, especially in the 1970s onward, the focus and the main theme of disco is, focused on the everyday person. So we're not really focusing on stars. We're focusing on people who live in our communities that we can see, that we can write from the perspective of. And so in the 1970s, erotic labor is just really positioned, especially in cities, as just another like job. It's something that's known, that's well known among community members. You could definitely like walk across the stroll in your neighborhood if you wanted to, and really build connection with these sex workers if you wanted to. And so when discotheques become much more popular, and sex workers, especially full service sex workers who are renegading, would find a lot of the clientele within these discos, we really see like a meld of first we really see like contact with a lot of the celebrities and stars, producers, musicians of that age, who are also present in these discotheques, also enjoying their time in the discotheques. We see the first kind of connections between them. They become clients, they become collaborators, but then we also really get to see a lot of the records that come out that are featured on sex work really kind of position their experiences, because this is what these are what fans of disco music, disco culture actually want to hear. Although I'm sure there are like hits that are penned about like porn stars and things like that, they don't really become popular. It's really just, again, the focus on the streetwalker, the focus on those on the strolls, on the piers, that really become popular as far as like focus on music and about sex work of that age becomes. So in a lot of ways, if that music focused around sex workers, becomes taboo for that age, but at the same time, it's pushing enough of those boundaries so that other artists at that time can continue to experiment with sex and talking about pleasure, erotic labor in ways that they haven't before. In a lot of ways, if sex work wasn't sort of that taboo subject matter for that time, other sorts of taboo subject matters about, for example, like oral or sexual positions and things like that, that wouldn't be possible to include in a hit, or wouldn't be able to, that were included in a song and wouldn't have become a hit. But because we are able to really see the expansion of that in disco music, we see a lot of that focus on subject matter change just from the disco culture and disco era of that time.
Yeah, I think like something that stood out to me, like especially during the Black History Month takeovers, just looking at each person's week, seeing that, I mean, for one, like Billie Holiday being a sex worker and being open about it. I don't know if there were any bops made about it, but there were others that were made by other artists during that era, but there were definitely, I remember a quote from them, not verbatim, but she did say something to the effect of like hearing her first jazz bop in a whorehouse. And I think, when we get to hip hop, we're seeing, like you were saying, like, you're used to seeing, motherfuckers in big bodies riding down the stroll and playing a certain type of music, right? So on the West Coast, that might sound like something. Down South, that might sound like something. In Chicago or out East, that might sound like something. And then I know Mimi has a lot to say about this because it definitely falls in their era. What do you think?
So I'm sorry, I missed the question in my mind right now.
No, it's okay. We're just talking about, Black erotic labor spaces, breaking records and artists.
Exactly. Yeah, that actually is perfect. Yeah. So Within the 2000s, especially within hip hop specifically, we see a change in the kind of the construction of hip hop and what is pushing the mainstream. From the 90s and early 90s to 80s, it was mainly street culture. And as Erica put it, also pimp culture that was driving force. But when we got to the 2000s, especially, a lot of this is contributed to the death of Pac and Biggie and the gang wars that insisted after that. Record labels wanted a cleaner image or something that wasn't as risky, and therefore we started to see more of an explosion of sex within hip hop. It was already there, but it became a lot more overt, and we started to see songs that were more tailored to the clubs and to club culture. And then this also, we then get to see, you know, we bring in the strippers and strip club culture and that hoe culture, specific subset of hoe culture, and how that ends up catapulting so many artists. When you understand the dynamics of the clubs and how that can actually push artists into a whole new arena, strippers and clubs become a main focus for artists to break it in the industry. Specifically, artists that I can think of off the top of my head, of course, are Nicki Minaj. Future is a huge one within the 2010 era. And we see, you know, artists like Nelly and henceforth Diddy, of course. But as we see these artists, we continue to see that the backbone of their career and their plays and just their success really relies on, again, hoes. Like Erica has said, it is a soundtrack and the music that we choose to listen to, play, perform to, that builds a fantasy for clientele. But also these like songs, if you think about it, like these songs end up when you create that moment within a club, these songs are easily going viral. How many times do you see a video on the TL and not only are you seeing how amazing these girls' tricks are, but also, damn, what is that song? Like, it just adds so much momentum to it. So yeah, the club ends up being just this, honestly, a mecca for artists, especially within the South. I guess I'll start my presentation now. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, word. So we start within, you know, again, the 2000s. Erica really summed up the best of that when it came to video vixen culture. But also we see a rise in the hip hop sound and elements from the South. For me personally, I'm Nigerian, but I really enjoy Southern music and Southern hip hop music sound, specifically because I feel that it is what Southern folks are able to do with that reminds me of what Igbo folks do with their music. We're able to make these euphoric sounds, even if we're talking about something really sad or something that, you know, isn't too quote unquote positive, but it's the sounds and the elements that we use that are able to create these melodic, almost hypnotizing sounds that can stay in your mind and really entrance somebody. And as a dancer, that's the type of music you want. So we're seeing that these sounds are growing. We have the South that is very known for the triplets. You know, of course, we know the Migos, that triplet sound that has been really honestly trademarked by the South and nurtured. And we have that low gritty bass that's so important. And when you think about a club sound, everyone knows how important the bass is. Hip hop also understanding that it is birthed out of a specific context of right on the backs of disco. Right on the, some people will say it is the child of Motown. And the original R&B, soul, and all of that. So we see that hip hop is starting to make its own sound and create its own lane for itself, and not just being the child of these genres. So what's also important, though, is as we are seeing this club culture, whole culture, moving into the mainstream again. 90s hip hop was pretty mainstream for the most part, but in the 2000s we had this boom with sex, and it just continues. I think it's really wild because I feel like maybe the early 2000s there was sex, but when it came to the late 2000s, early 2010s, we start to see huge like emphasis on specifically strip club culture. Again, we have Nicki Minaj that comes out, looking at who her managers were. When we look at like Big D, I believe, out of Atlanta. Yes, yes. Who was her manager and was very close to the streets. We understand to see how these artists begin to fuel these relationships with DJs and club goers and club promoters and everything to get on. Future is probably like the best example of this. I don't like that raggedy nigga, and I'm gonna say it because I have to put that on the record. Look, but he was very smart in his marketing. There is a YouTube video. I'm blanking on the name, but I will put it in the chat and link it. But there is a video that talks about basically the creation of just Southern culture and strip club culture specifically, and how that was so important and vital. And Future says it from his own mouth himself, that he knew that I'm not a club person. I may not always be in the clubs, but I knew that I had to do that because marketing wise, that was a place where I knew I was going to get hot. Like, it doesn't matter as long as you have hundreds of people coming into a club every day. Those 100 people listen to your songs. You pay the right artist and boom. So as we're seeing this boom in strip club culture, at the same time, we're also, we may not be seeing it, but at the same time, there's a growing movement, organizing movement that's happening among strippers. We start to see strippers, and I think it's important that when the strip culture ends up pushing more into the mainstream, strippers themselves are able to also use this momentum to push their own agendas and their own movements for their own rights. We start to see dancers suing their clubs, and for basically a lot of it is misclassification of employment. So what happens is dancers are categorized as independent contractors. However, as an independent contractor, that means that you have full control over your hours when you come in, how you work and whatnot. However, if you are a dancer, you know you do not have control over your hours. You may have control over your hours, but you don't have control over how you work, what you do, like all of that, you know. And we begin to start seeing in my opinion, I think it's not only just a movement for sex workers, but this ends up pushing a bigger movement when it comes to just worker rights, period. Sex workers and strippers being able to sue their places of employment, and receiving settlements for it, huge settlements for it. It was extraordinary and huge. And it was also the organizing power that it took to be able to do this. You had clubs who had locations from California to Tennessee, and dancers being able to organize amongst states, especially state laws and labor laws, to fight for, their due right, and not having to pay fees to a club owner at the end of the night, even though you control everything I do and like what song I can play. You feel me? Those are serious things. So I think it's really beautiful in a way. There's a lot to still be done. There are a lot of clubs that have had this, and we see, Magic City, as we all know, honestly, the Mecca of the Mecca, in many people's opinion, their dancers actually sued the club, and from 2013, for wages from 2013 to 2017, it's still unclear whether it was settled, but it's still unclear the actual outcome of that. But dancers did sue for the misclassification of independent contractors. We had the Rick's Cabaret in Manhattan, from the years of 2005 to 2015, who also sued around the same premise, as well as, sexual harassment, abuse. There's plenty of other things that go into these lawsuits, but this is able to push a greater conversation as well around strip club culture, and club culture, as well as the importance of strippers, truthfully. They really were the backbone for an entire like decade of music. If you think about what music was coming out and what music was banging, at least from maybe like 2016 to I'll say 2017 to about 2007, the trap beat sounds, Race Murder, Nicki Minaj, Gucci coming back, so many artists, and all of them were
Jeezy.
what was that?
Jeezy. I
Yes,
feel like Jeezy broke in the strip club too.
yes, Jeezy. Just all those Southern artists that were nurtured by that sound, but also nurtured by these environments and brought up, even though, especially like an artist like Nicki Minaj and Future, we know they don't respect hoes. Um, so understanding that and seeing, I mean, whole culture, in my opinion, is the backbone and the reason why hip hop has been able to be so successful as a mainstream genre, and to the point where we can even look at hip hop and say like, it's almost like the new pop music in some ways. That this sound has been able to expand so far globally, and a lot of that has to do with the fact of the music that we have curated when we want to be in erotic spaces, and when we want to explore sex. So as we're leaving this age of music and we're starting to shift, there's a new rise of artists coming, a new generation of artists, and a lot of them, in my opinion, the ones that are heavy hitters in my eyes, I try not to be biased, but they are femmes, they are women, and they are non-binary folks, and a lot of them are controlling their own narrative in a different way than we see like with artists like Little Kim and Foxy. You know, even though they are pretty much the mothers of this new generation, there is still so much male input and male hands when it came to sculpting their image and how they were presented. And now that we're in an age where artists can actually be independent and control their own sounds, media, perceptions, it's created a whole new a lane for feminine women, femme presenting artists to come about and fuck shit up. Really, that's it. I like to think of this as dominatrix rap. A lot of the aesthetics, especially we can see with an artist like Meg Thee Stallion, uses dominatrix aesthetics, dominatrix attire to push this sound of sex, but also within a lane and within a perspective where they have full control over sex and pleasure. We can always debate about what that really means. But in terms, it is promoting the domination aspect and female domination within sex. I think Meg Thee Stallion really does an amazing job. Another artist I can think of off the top of my head is Zed Kenzo out of Minnesota, Minneapolis. I'm sorry, those I'm sorry, anything north, I don't remember it. It's really bad. But Minneapolis, Zed Kenzo. Also, we have Queen Zariah out of Washington, D.C. We have a lot of amazing emerging artists that I'm continuously finding every day, and this new genre and this new lane that is just pushing this sound. In my opinion, I feel like this, especially Rico Nasty too, I will say, though some of these people may not be doms actually, we do see that they use hoe culture and dom culture. I'm starting to even want to go further and say that if we have the heavy hitters that we had when it came to strip club culture and like strip club culture, and from the last decade, it is possible that we could see another decade or a new decade of hip hop with the incorporation of BDSM culture as well. Yes, shout out to Meg Thee Stallion's mom, because she really held that child down and gave her everything. Yeah, so I don't know if it's possible. I kind of want to say it is because we have a lot of heavy hitters. But I also do think that the only reason why maybe dom rap may not go as far as a strip club culture is only because unless you have some niggas maybe rapping from the sub perspective. I don't know how far it will go, only because it is very hard for the public to really provide respect, acceptance, and support around the lyricism and sounds from women and femme presenting artists. However, I think that this is such a heavy scene right now, that I can't imagine it not having at least 5 more years of reign, very strong reign. And I don't know, it's gonna be really interesting. And also, I mean, like, we can see how these cultures can clearly intertwine, especially with even strip club culture. But there's something new coming, and it's a lot more alternative. I will say, I think that the sound is a lot more grungy, and can be a bit more punky at times. But I think that's maybe the sexiness about it. I don't know, like boss bitch vibes. Hashtag, I don't know. But yeah.
Thank you, Continue.
Of course.
Wow. I just want to say that everything I learned this evening was amazing. And I have so many questions, but I want to start first with Q&A from the audience. And since Jaslyn already like populated the questions with like so many good ones, I just want to hand it over first to Jaslyn to prompt the rest of the conversation for the last 18 minutes we have tonight.
Yeah, I had so many questions, and much respect for y'all for being here and sharing this history with us, especially like, which is part of our culture that doesn't get spoken to enough. So much respect, putting respect on that. I think one of the first questions that popped up is, why do you think Corinne and Stefan's was able to successfully elevate their voice? And how can we elevate more voices in the work that Heaux History is doing?
I think as far as Corinne is concerned, I mean, Shorty's light-skinned, there's that. And also just was able, in my opinion, able to get ahead on something that kind of became a trend or is now sort of a thing, like something that we're seeing more, the tell-all from you know, people who were in the game, or someone who you know what I'm saying, used to deal with higher profile celebrities, particularly rappers, so on and so forth. But I think when Corinne had her first memoir, I think that it was just so scathing, and there was so much tea, and we hadn't really seen a tell-all with those sort of themes like come out like that. I think that was another reason. And then also I just sometimes I really think, like, overall when it comes to hoes in general, but in Corinne Stefan's case, I think at least in the beginning, people really underestimated Shorty. Like they really do her like she doesn't know what she's doing. Like she's not mindful or intentional enough to have been able to pull this off. And so I think a lot of the anger around her success not only, of course, has to do with her like you know, sharing intimate details about, you know, relationships with certain types of men who are, you know, that people want to read about because they're celebrities and they're in the game and we want to know about their sex life and we're nosy and we like gossip and we like messiness. But also, I think that whether her colleagues wanted to admit it or not, I think that there was also an interest from people who were like, finally, you know what I'm saying? Like somebody who, whether people could argue it's fabricated or not, or certain things, you know, don't resonate with them. There was finally something where someone who had worked in these spaces was like, okay, this is what we're up against and this is what we're dealing with. And I think it was hard for people to swallow the fact that this is a hoe who's also demanding respect and who's also saying, I experienced these very harmful things. I also had joyful experiences and I'm sharing them all in this one piece of work. But I think Shorty had the right to do what she did and to continue what, you know, she is doing, even though problematic in some ways, because I could go forever and ever on a list of artists and names of songs where Superhead is part of their lyrics. So for anyone to have an issue with her, you know, banking off of the name that someone gave her, the name that, you know, popularized her presence in these videos, but also that is the reason that people bought these books, the reason that she was a bestseller and that she was in Oprah's damn book. A hoe was in Oprah's book club. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's gonna piss people off. But I did see a lecture of hers recently. It was in the last few years, and she's speaking at I believe an HBCU. And before the talk, there was a little bit of backlash about her presence on that campus for these reasons. And something that really stuck with me, and something that is in the back of my mind whenever we're doing things with Heaux History, is her getting up on the podium and her just saying before she started her presentation, I know a lot of you didn't want me to be here, but I'm here. And she said it with so much pride, but also a little bit of pain, but also a matter of factness. And the fuck are you gonna do about it? That I don't know, that really hits my little cockles of my heart. But I would say, as far as making sure that the voices of Heaux History are amplified and that the work we're doing is continued, great ways to support us would be just to follow us on social media. We're under Heaux History on IG and Twitter. We also have a Patreon. We're working on our website right now, which will have links to a digital archive. And also, if you see any articles written by our team members, or if you see any events that we're spearheading or organizing, just, you know, pull up and show out.
Thank you. I had other questions, but there were some more in the chat. So I can pass, you know, I don't want to take up all the time.
Well, I think your next question and the question from Jade after that are very related. Jade asks, have you been able to explore the transnational connections, similarities, points of difference within the histories of Black and Brown sex worker communities? And Jaslyn had asked right before that, are there examples of communities, spaces, and societies where sexual suppression is less present? So it's kind of a 1-2.
I don't. So we have definitely looked at the connections between, you know, our histories within the Black and Brown sex worker community. One of our members, Ronnie, did a beautiful interview of the sex work collective in India, who is actually the founders of International Sex Workers Rights Day. That also coincides around International Women's Day, I believe, right? And March 3rd. And
Yeah.
understanding their history and the work that they've done while creating, it starts from a movement and a protest, but also organizing to create actual intentional communities where that results in jobs for members of the community, their own central banking system, creating clinics for their community members. And we can definitely see these things happening. I mean, there's a lot of LGBT and trans community clinics that we know of who specifically make sure to look for and work with sex worker communities, considering that how many of us end up being sex workers and the importance of our health when it comes to that. But one thing that I do feel that I have learned the most from stories like that is the necessity to connect and create more coalition building amongst us within the United States, not only within the United States, but abroad as well, because there's so much that we can learn. Being in the US, a lot of our knowledge and what we do is centered so much when, in my opinion, truthfully, it's all right compared to what others are having to do in other countries. The suppression and the oppression looks a lot different than what we're going through. Here in America, we have a lot more of a covert oppression. We are oppressed, but many people do not see it or feel it the way that you only feel it unless you're in specific margins. Whereas in other countries, like I can think of Nigeria, in our own home country, like I can't even walk down the street with tattoos because I'll be considered a cult member or anything else, or walking down the street with an iPhone and you're considered you know, an armed robber or whatever the hell. These things, we have to learn from the oppressions and the violence, as well as the resistance that are going on in other countries, because they can help inform us on how we move. It's like when we see what happens in Ferguson from Palestine and the tactics that they use on protesters there, and how those tactics will be taught here in the United States, because we know that the IDF trains our police. So when we understand these connections more thoroughly, when we really end up talking to each other and like really digging deep at the root of things, we can not only build international coalitions, not only domestic coalitions, but we can build a stronger front of knowledge and wisdom on how to fight back strategically, specifically. I'd also say that to the other point, the sexual suppression, I think that's really hard because, I mean, in our society dictates the sexual expression of everywhere else, if that makes sense. Western society and colonialism has done a lot. Like walking around nude is sexualized. You know, like if I had my titties out here on the Zoom, this whole thing would be shut down. Cause when like I could just, it's hot and my titties are sweating. You feel me? Like, so just, I think it takes more knowledge of history and what, who we were before colonialism to know how deeply we've been suppressed. And I think it really delves deep when we look at gender and the not only the creation of gender, but how that gender has been used against people, specific societies, and how that in turn affects our sexuality, our understanding of ourselves as sexual beings, and how we operate with others as sexual beings. And that's very like case by case, but if you look at many indigenous cultures compared to where they are now under this Western colonial like reign or really mentality and perspective, we begin to see how much we have lost of ourselves culturally, historically, and how much farther we have to go to be able to get back to those points and really understanding what true suppression has occurred.
Well, that almost made me cry. And really, yeah, okay, I'm just gonna ask one more question, just to top it off from that point, and it's coming from your words, Mimi, that you wrote, you know, I dream of a time when the Heaux History Project will only archive our history, but actively preserve Heaux while they are with us in the living world. And that this can only happen when Black and brown sex workers collectively work with each other to build something greater than ourselves with sustainability and longevity in mind. And I think there's something really just so promising and beautiful about a project itself being a seed that's rooting and that's growing. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about how this project itself is serving as a place where sustainability is occurring now, and that longevity is being counted on by creating what you're doing.
I think when it comes to the sustainability and the longevity, not only of our project, but of a greater whole movement or coalition, perspective, idea, world, for us right now, and I think that my background as an organizer is a lot of mutual aid and creating alternative systems. Again, I really enjoyed the interview that Ronnie was able to create and, you know, get that knowledge, because it's that knowledge that fuels those ideas where, yeah, we could make our own bank. Like, we really could make our own world. We really could make our own clinic on the south side of Chicago, where if you need more condoms, if you need just another whole bag, if you need food, you can come into this space and get it. And you don't have to worry whether you even have a cent in your pocket, because that doesn't matter. If you're in need of an Uber ride back from a chick's house, you can call on us and we can get you home. That there is not only just us, but a wide array of networks, like an array of people who are there and ready to support our community members and build something bigger. For me, that is what I do believe and hope that Heaux History can do, whether it's what we actually do physically in you know, offline, which is what I plan to do, but also like the people who are inspired by this project, who are inspired by the narratives and the history that we're collecting. My godmother, Nahanda Soke Abiodun, I love what she says, and it's something all old heads will tell you, but you have to know where you've been to know where you're going. And we have to understand where we have been historically, culturally, and through resistance to know where we can go. We know as Black people the importance of mutual aid. And I don't mean like, I mean like mutual aid. Like, if I don't have food, I go to the pantry that I built in my house to get some. And if someone down the block doesn't have food, they can come to my house to get food from my pantry that we built, you know? These systems, if we continue to build them, if we were able to like hold down a market down the street, you know, that provides groceries, and we're able to like put on for every family within this zip code can get free groceries for a month, what that can do for people. It's about thinking not what we can do or what we can't do, but how we need to get things done. I'm an anarchist. And not in the sense of fuck government or order, but in the sense of I believe that the communal systems that we had before imperialism would be considered anarchy, but these communal systems that we have helped sustain us before all of this bullshit came around, and continue to sustain us through slavery and everything else. And we have to continue that within our own ways, because we cannot wait on anybody else to do it, because they don't want us to be here. And through this, archiving is really like the basic step of inspiring folks to see what you can do on your own with the people around you. But I mean, to be honest, we've been talking about this a lot. If anybody here got a space, anybody got some land, throw that my way, okay? You know, just throw some niggas' names on the deed or something.
I mean, I want to add to this, and I want to pass it to Zio after this, so Zio can close for us. But to add to what Mimi was saying, like, we're not huge, and we are still working on our resources and building what, you know, the type of archival project, but also like community fixture that we want to see. But something that I really have found joy in is, you know, we've only existed for 2 years at this point, and some of our, you know, all of our relationships, at least mine, with everyone on the team, and then I know everyone has their own relationship with each other too, but some of these relationships go back years, and we are very familiar with one another, either as organizers or the work that they've already done within community and in the industry. And so being able to build something together, being able to say like, hey, we're all trying to build, you know, something, we're all trying to preserve this particular history. Where do we go to find X, Y, and Z? And literally having to say, okay, I guess we got to make it, which isn't to say that there aren't other efforts like this, or there aren't other efforts that matter and all of that. But it is to say that when we started, it was just like a documentary idea. And we realized very quickly with the type of support that we had and the feedback that we were getting that this was something much larger than that. And that we had an opportunity to really create a space where other Black, Brown, and Indigenous sex workers who are looking for their elders in our histories, who don't want to have to pay, you know what I'm saying, a bunch of money just to access academic texts, or who are shut out of the academic spaces that they're in when they're trying to create theoretical work, or when they're putting together their creative pieces, when they're, you know, for Black sex workers who are organizers, for everyone who fits in these categories, who are looking for this type of space where you can find sex worker history that's rooted in Blackness, that's Black led, that is Black centered. Being able to create that like alongside people that you really respect and people who you know also have the same vision and who are very much so committed to that means a lot. And so I think that we've been able to build something really great up to this point. And in the future, I'm hoping that that looks like Mimi said, us having a permanent space where we can have like in-person archives, you know, a space where you can see sex worker elders on the wall being celebrated, and not as some cautionary tale or, you know, sob story all the time. A space where we can all share our stories and create together and organize together. And yeah, in that I've been able to find a lot of joy and a lot of community, and I'm hoping that that is expanded in the future.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with my co-creative directors here. And I think what I really want to just end with is that just even being part of the project, being able to contribute in the ways that I have to the archive, it's just really cemented to me, and I hope to cement to other people that, you know, sex workers, Black and brown sex workers, we've always been here. And not only have we always been here and just been present in the shadows, we have made significant contributions to the culture around us and to the way that people think, not just about sex, not just about sex work, but even about their own interpersonal relationships, about their own communities. Being able to show that sex workers have always been an important community members, have always been able to contribute to the fabric of the community around them is a really big pleasure of mine and a really big motivator for the work that I do, not just with Heaux History, but in general. Just like Mimi said, you got to know where you've been to know where you're going, and being able to show just exactly where we have been in all the spaces that we've been in and all the impact that we have made, I believe will really show onlookers and anybody else who have doubted us and our contributions. We'll be able to show them that we're going to be here for the long haul in the future as well, still being impactful, still being influential, still being able to create these shifts that you're not even aware of, or don't think that much about. And again, just music, popular culture, just one of the easiest arenas that we're able to showcase that. But you know, be sure that that influence extends far beyond just culture and music. It extends to so many different areas of life that sex workers, hoes, have been able to really change and improve. So I'm very grateful to be part of a project that does that, and to contribute to that project as much and as long as I possibly can.
Thank you. Thank you, Heaux History. Thank you to Coding Stigma. And thank you, everyone, for joining us in this conversation today. I definitely want to urge you to support Heaux History. We drop many links many times to social media accounts, to Venmos, and to their Patreon. So I want to hear back from them that, like, you know, they just were flooded with love, you know, so we can do that. Let's do that. And we can also share some love in the chat, you know. But yeah, that's it for our panel with Heaux History for tonight. And hopefully we'll see you all for day 3 of Black Brown Origins. That link is also in the chat if you want to RSVP for the next events that we have coming up, which is a talk about Black women's with an X, rebuttal, with Mika Gadsden, who is an activist and cultural worker down in Charleston, South Carolina, Dirty South. And also a healing sound bath with Eves B. Golden of the Human, it's just, you know, an acronym for Herbal Mutual Aid Network in New York. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you for having us and giving us an opportunity to share this with everyone.
Yes, yes, of course. And hoping that we can do more projects together in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that part. Good night.